Okay, so everything is fine, and so we can resume after the Easter break, right? And so we are here in the calendar, and today we will talk briefly, very briefly, about the React context, which is a useful APIs to avoid using too many props in components. And then we will talk more in details about the router, okay, React router. And we will see, as usual, an example. We take the usual example that we have and we transform it using the routes. Tomorrow we are going to meet in the lab, as usual, R3B and room 10I, for the React forms that we didn't do yet. And then after, well, I would say a long break again, we will, you will meet my colleague Antonio on the 8th of May for doing the lab about what we are talking about today. Okay, so the React router. And then the schedule proceeds as usual. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the context. So, what's the context? What is meant to be? To help for? Okay. So, actually, you know that in React we have this hierarchy of components. We have the element tree. There's a root, and in root there's the app component, the one that is created by Vite when we start a new project. And then you have a tree like the one you see on the right, where if you need to pass information to the children components, you need to pass props. Okay, and this has to be done at each level. Okay, every time you have new children, you need to pass props. Okay, and so if you have to pass a prop from here, from the root to a child which is deep inside the tree, you need to pass at each level the prop. You take props.name and you pass it as an attribute, and you do it again and again and again down towards the component that actually needs the value. Okay, so this is called drilling through, okay, or props drilling. Okay, so making holes, let's say it in this way. For the props in the root or in higher levels of the tree to go down until where they are needed. And this is sometimes inconvenient because there is information that is needed in many components and that has to be stored in the root or almost in the root, and that is needed in the leaves of the tree. Okay, and if you have no other way of passing information except props, you need to have attribute equal to prop and so on at every component, basically. And so the solution to this problem is the context. The context API offers a global set of props that can be made automatically available to lower components, lower in the tree, okay, without declaring them explicitly at every level, okay, without passing them as attribute equal to value. A sort of teleporting, so transporting information remotely automatically. Examples of this kind of information. Well, for instance, the information that is common to the whole application, like the theme, okay, it's a dark theme, it's a light theme, and so on. Or we will see it later in the course, it's the logged in or logged out status. You have the information about the logged in user, okay? You might need it in many different places inside your application because you want to show something which is different depending on the condition, logged in or logged out. Or in general, other shared data or the support for languages, for instance. Every component has to show some text, and if you have to translate the information, you need to have some objects or some system that gives you the translation for the current language, and this, of course, has to be distributed to every component. So this is just an example why it can be useful, to transporting this information in a quick and in a quick way to every component without having to declare it at each component. And so how does it work? Well, there are three elements we need to care about. They are the three in red. Well, first we need to define a context. Then we need to say where it applies. So in which set of components the information is distributed. So this is the context provider. And then where it is consumed. So where the values are used. Okay? We will see these three aspects in a minute in the next slides. Okay? So how to define a context? Well, there's a call from react.createContext. You pass a default value, it's a kind of an initialization value, because in case you need it, you can pass it, okay? But then you have the opportunity to set the value for the context later in the provider, okay? So this creates a new context object. It means that it has some properties that are available when you use the context, okay? Remember that the value is just one, but it can be any JavaScript value. So typically it's an object, a JavaScript object. So you can store more information inside the context. And this variable, so this reference to the context, has to be made available to your whole application where you need it. In short, you need to import this value where you need it inside your application. And then components may subscribe, it means consume the value of this context. So take the value from this context. Okay. There can be more than one context. In the slides, you'll find the information, the detailed information on how to handle more context, like the closest provider is used and so on. But I mean, if you restrict yourself to using just one context, things are very simple. You create a context, you make it available in up or in something very close to the root of the tree, and then you just use it wherever you need it inside the components. Okay. So defining the context, that's one thing. For instance, we will see an example. It's already on the GitHub, and we will not spend the time coding it. It's just ready for us. It's just a code that we will see on the slides. Just ready to run and try. And we will try it together in a few minutes. And so let's assume we would like to create a very simple multi-language application. It's just a button. You click it, there's a state, and the state decides in which language the text is shown, Italian or English. Okay? And so the point is that we have a few components where we would like to pass the information about what we need to show, not through props, but through the context. So we see how the context works. Okay? So this is up. There's a use state. This is a traditional use state. I mean, the state that we saw until last time. No difference. Okay? There's a function that changes the state because it uses the set state function, set language returned by the use state. Okay? And then of course, I mean, this is just no context. So we have a button. We just no, sorry. This is the one with the context. But we have a button component, our button component, where we pass a function, toggle language. So when we press the button, we will call the set state and we will change the information about the state. And so the language will change because I think the welcome has to use either the Italian or English information, okay? And you see that we don't pass props here in welcome. Without the context, we should pass something like message equal to, and take the information, okay, from this variable that we pass as an attribute. But we would like to make the example using context, okay? So take the prop, the information outside properties. Okay, so we define a context, React create context, empty, I mean, default value is undefined. We don't pass anything, it's undefined. We will define it later. Export language context. It's useful, typically it's useful to define the context in a file which is outside the, the rest of the application, because in this way you can import it wherever you need it, okay? Okay, so in app, of course, you need to import it because you define it outside. And then we need to decide where the information is available and then how to use the information. So when you create a new context, there are two components which actually don't render in the DOM, but they are React components that are created, the provider and the consumer. Okay, when you want to give a value to be used by the context, you need to pass something to the provider. Okay, so and the provider is just the one that is available by the object created by the React create context. Okay, was xContext.provider in React 18. In 19 you don't have to specify the props, and they simplify the syntax. I mean, you can still use the older syntax anyway. So of course they can be nested and so on, but we said, I mean, we don't care too much about this very peculiar and complex situations. The point is that the value works like as props. If the value changes, React is in charge of recreating and re-render all the components that use the value of the context that has changed. Okay, so they work in principle like props. If they change, the component is re-rendered. And it is used in this way. So you import the language context from the language context, so it means this one. Okay, so they create context, and you use it as a normal component in the JSX. Okay, JSX, it just doesn't render in DOM because it's not an element of HTML. It's just an element of React. Okay, and here you pass a value attribute with the value that you would like to pass, okay, to all the components where you would like to use this value, so consume this value. Okay, so everything which is inside the open and closed language context will receive this value passed here, which is in this case language, which is I think the value that was in the here the use state. Okay. Okay, good. So that's the way in which you provide the context to the other components, to the children components, which are the ones which are nested inside. And then how you use it? Well, the most convenient way is to use the hook. There's a use context hook that basically is a function of React you can call that gives you the value that corresponds to the provider once you give the name of the context. Okay, and the value depends on the closing and closing provider. If there's just one, is the one that you provided. Okay, so okay, it's nice to have hooks because they are simple to write, simple to read, easy to understand, and so on. But just be careful, there is no way to create a new context object or a provider with hooks. So in short, we need to use React create context and the syntax that we saw before, like a component in the JSX for creating and creating the context and inserting the provider in the element tree. Okay, but for using it, which is the most common operation, there's the use context hook, which is very simple because you call it, it has a return value, and the return value is the value that you're interested in. Okay, so let's see the example. So the example is here. So you pass language here in the provider, and then there are components like button and welcome, where you simply use the value. And so use context, language context, will return what you pass here in value, so the language. It's just available without accessing the props. It's something that is done automatically by React, okay? However, the provider must be declared over the components that are using the value, okay? So the components need to be nested inside the provider, of course, okay? So the provider provides values only to the children components. But you see that the syntax is very simple. Const language equal to use context and the context that you created with React. And that's why it's useful to have it defined externally, because you can simply import it if you are in another file, and that's all. Okay. And when you have the value, well, you can do whatever you want as usual, as you do with props. Okay. So in this case, we have a global variable translations that contains, well, actually it's an object that contains a key that is the language, and then the translations. Okay. Okay. So basically, we realized a way to pass information from here, from this point, to the children components without passing props. Okay. So without the attribute plus the value. By the way, use context can be called more than once if you have more context. Of course, that's fine. But I mean, if you just have one context, it's fine to use just one context. And remember that this object can also be, this value can also be an object, a JavaScript object. Okay. When a consumer child needs to update the context value, well, that's the same problem that we have with props, and we can solve it in the same way. We just include an element inside the object that we pass as the value of the context that is a reference to a function, and this function will do the change of the state, so we'll set the state, and that's all. React will do everything for us. It will do the update and so on. Okay. Of course, you are free to use the traditional way using props and so on, but I mean, you can just pass an object instead of a single value inside the value of the context, and one value can be text, so strings, numbers, and so on. Another value can be a function, and of course, you can use the function also to pass a function that changes something that is used inside the context, like a state. Yeah, just remember the state is part of the component containing the provider. Okay, it's not in the provider itself. We don't have access to the provider. Provider is created by the create context. It's created by React. We cannot write what's inside the provider, and it is not in the context object again. I mean, and we don't have access to the context object as well. I mean, we have access to the properties needed to make it work, but I mean, we cannot store values. And so just like this. So the state is here. It's in app, because in app, in the component app, we put the provider, the language context provider. Okay, that's all. Okay. So, well, now you learned a very powerful mechanism to pass values around inside your application, right? So you might be tempted to use context for everything, and in principle it might work, but it will break a lot of things. I mean, if we don't pass, only the props that are needed to the components, but we pass context, basically it means that every time something changes in the context, everything gets re-rendered, which is not what we want, right? So the context has to be used only for something which is really needed in many places inside your application. Otherwise, it wastes the advantages of React, right? So just don't use it because you are lazy. You don't want to write additional attributes and so on in components, in component definition and usage. And don't use it to correct design errors. I mean, if you don't know how to pass a value to a component, it's probably there's something wrong in the way the values are distributed inside the application. So probably you should refactor something. That means maybe moving up a state or passing a prop that derives from a state which is in another position, so you need to move this state again and so on. Most of the programming difficulties that you might encounter are probably due to the fact that the state is in a place where it shouldn't be. So it's too low in the tree. You should move it up. Okay, that's the state lifting we talked about a few lectures ago, right? And of course, it reduced the purity of functional components because it's side information coming inside the component. So I mean, it's fine if it's limited in usage and it's very clear where we are using it. Okay. So there is also an additional way of consuming the value. I mean, it's less commonly used because the way with the hook is very simple, very simple to write and to read, to understand. But I mean, just for completeness, sometimes you might find this syntax. I mean, there's a component you can put in the JSX, so the context.consumer, but then you need to define a function, okay, that takes as a parameter a value, and it gives you some JSX that is basically what you need to render. Much more difficult to write, a syntax which is not so intuitive. I think, no, that's the example, but I didn't put it into the code I wrote because it's much less intuitive. You see that you need to define the consumer and the callback function basically, and very difficult to read. Okay, just compare left and right. In case you have to context, you just use context. You have two variables and you use it as you like. Here you need to nest one thing inside the other thing with the callback function and so on. It's very difficult to write. So I would say, even though I mean the left part works, but it's much more difficult to write and to read. So let's try to avoid it. Okay. So this is much cleaner way of handling the context. So let's just try the example. Okay, so we have the context. So it's here in the lectures material, right? So you remember that we have lecture examples, week 9 context. Okay, just an example here. So the context, no, that's another directory. I don't want to use this directory. That's the solution. Week 09 context. Okay, let's make it bigger. So as usual, npm ci npm run dev open. Just a button. I mean, nothing really special. There's a hierarchy of React components. So that's up. That's this context provider that basically provide a value, and the value is an object made of two things. One is the language, so it's just a string, and the other is a function to change this language. That is basically the state in app that is passed as a context to the other two components. Welcome and my button. And you see that as they have no props, right? Welcome and button have no props. But they receive this context, okay? Let's see the code, because you saw it works, right? And actually the state is here in app and it, and that's all. And so the code is simply what we saw on the slides. So there's a state, a function to set the state, so change the state from it to n and vice versa. And the value in the language context provider, just this one. We define it on the fly. You see, the first curly bracket is just to open the value of the attribute value. And the second curly bracket is to define a JavaScript object. Okay, so we put two things inside this JavaScript object. One is a string, lang, okay, and the other is a toggle language, which is a reference to a function. That is the one that we saw before here. And then welcome and button. We just have a look at the code, I think in components. Welcome, you see, object, use context, language context, and then you extract from object whatever you need. Lang, okay, and you use it to decide what to show. Translation is just a file that contains an object with all the translations. Okay, nothing really special. Okay, so it's just an object. And here you show what you like in terms of you know, what is written above the button, and also inside the button you can write whatever you like depending on the language that you extracted from the object. This time we also needed the function to modify the state. Okay, it's available as any other properties inside the object that you passed as a context. Okay, so it's a very flexible way to substitute the props system in case you need to pass these values across many components. Of course, this example is very simple, so it's just one level. Okay, so we could have passed the props directly here, but we wouldn't have shown the context, right? But in case you have a more complex system, when for the exam you will have you know, a more complex application with many levels of components and so on, you just define a context at the up level, for instance with the logged in user or whatever, and you can distribute this information to the rest of your application in case it's needed. Okay, and where it's needed, you just call use context with the correct context. Okay, just one if there is only one in the application, and the information is available to you, and it works as props. If the information changes, React will re-render the components and so on. Okay, it's React's task to re-render the components when it's needed. Okay, so in principle it should be very simple, both to understand and to use. Okay, are there any questions? Otherwise, I think you have a look at the example, and then we will not have a lab on the context. It's not mandatory for the exam. I mean, we don't really care if you like passing props, which also say that it's a good way to document the code and so on. That's fine. Okay, no problem. If you like to use the context because you think, I mean, it's too long to write, you know, at every level passing, I don't know, the information about the user or the theme or the language or whatever you need to pass, try to use the context. Okay? Okay, good. So, no question. It seems there are no questions. Okay, so still recording. And so let's come to the, I would say, more important topic for today's lecture. I mean, not that the others are not, but, you know, of course, a router is probably needed. I think I didn't see an exam submission without the router until now, so probably you need to use it. Okay, but I mean, again, it's not mandatory, but basically when the application is not really very simple, I mean, you start having the need of different views in your applications, and this router can help you quite a lot, and so basically we need it. And there are also other reasons that we are going to see in a minute. Okay, so first of all, why we need the router? Okay, When you have a complex web application, by complex means something that has many views, I mean, like normal application we interact with. Typically, you have different views, okay, like the login view, then there's the main page, and there's a detailed view, or and something like this, or the edit page, the add page, and so on. And you might want to divide the application into pages, okay? This was traditionally done in traditional old web applications by different URLs that correspond to different resources on the server, okay? We say that in single page applications, everything is managed by the client, and so there is just one URL on the server that loads the application at the beginning, and that's all. And then we interact with the server with APIs to exchange information, not pages, okay? But I mean, these ways of managing the flow of navigation across pages is very convenient, okay? It's something that is useful even today, even with the single page applications and so on. So if there is a way to replicate this behavior, this old behavior, but which is still very convenient, that would be nice. And indeed, actually, it's what the router does for, in this case, React. Because, I mean, we are used to, navigate the web with a forward and backward button sometimes. And we are used to bookmark URLs, okay? And these URLs typically convey information, so they represent some resource that needs to be shown when this URL is typed on the browser URL bar, URL box, okay? And also, when you have a complex web application, if you have the URLs, but you type the URLs, the browser reloads information from the server. This is not good because code is reloaded, information needs to be refetched from the server, and so on. So if we have a way to manage the behavior of changing URLs or make the application appear like a traditional web application, but with this new paradigm of the single page application, that is good because we don't need to reload a lot of JavaScript code, information, and state of the application from the server. But at the same time, we allow the user to see on which page it is, I mean the URL, and it can even bookmark the URL if we write the application in a certain way, so that if you access that URL, you get the same resource. Okay, but this is a bit out of scope of the course. Most of the single page applications we use today are made in this way. This is Facebook, right? But it can be anything, okay? So there's the slash, the basic URL. When you access a website, facebook.com, slash, and it loads the view, that's the initial view of the application. It also loads all the code and so on from the server. But then, depending on where you navigate, it changes the URL on top in the browser URL box, and it puts some URL which is I would say significant, that is pertinent to what the application is showing. And so depending on the view the application is showing, the URL changes accordingly, okay, without reloading the page. Okay, we have a way in JavaScript to change this URL. Actually, we will not do it ourselves, but we will delegate this behavior to the library, the React router library, for changing the URL and telling us which URL is currently shown in the browser URL box, and show something that is pertinent to that URL. Okay, so basically we're just trying to emulate what most of the single page applications nowadays do. Okay, so nothing really new. So there's plenty of use cases in which you would like to change the URL. So basically each time you have a new view, something new to show, basically you would like to have a different URL. like the main list and a detailed view, or like a logged in, logged out, unlogged page, or the sidebar, or I mean, like an add page, as we will have later, or an edit page, and so on. Okay? So there's plenty of use cases. And designing the URLs is something you need to get used to. And indeed, there will be a lab in which you will try to design pages for the application you already have in the lab, which is, the user film library. And the film library has the functionality to add a new film, edit a new film, and you might try to add new pages for this view, these new views. Okay, we will try to do it today also for the question and answer example that we are carrying on during the lectures, and we will do something similar. Okay, so before trying to experiment with our application, well, let's reflect a little bit for a moment what the URL is actually is for our application. Well, the URL actually, well, except the slash, which is the initial state of the application, so what is loaded in the beginning, basically the URL contains a state of our application, because what we are currently showing is actually a current state of our application. If you think in terms of the example that we carried on until now, you know that we press the add. You remember the application. Maybe I can load the application so you remember the application. We had the question and answers application, and you remember that we can press add and show something, right? So a different view, let's say, that includes the part in which we can add something. But at the moment here in the URL, nothing changes. Okay, sorry, I clicked it. Nothing changes. It would be nice if the URL changes, like /add, /edit, /whatever. But actually, this is a state of the application. And indeed, if you search inside the application, you will notice that, maybe you recall that we have a state. Here, there's no name. Let's have a look in the code. That's a state that says if the add has to be shown or not, right? So I think it's in app. App main. Yeah, show form, right? That's a state. And we are moving that state to the URL. Okay, so we will get rid of that state, which is actually a presentation state that says if you need to show the form or not. And if you have the slash, we will not show the form. If we have slash something else, like /add, /edit, that is an indication we need to show the form. Okay, with the rest, without the rest, I mean, I don't really care. But I mean, the point is that we are moving some part of the application state to the URL. Okay, good. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, so the URLs embed well, for sure, embed information in general terms like /add, /edit, and so on, but can also embed specific information like the item IDs and so on. You might have like you might have used application like, I don't know, Facebook.com. I think this example is a bit old, and maybe they changed the way in which they arrange the URLs, but I mean the principle is the same. Like you want to show post number 1234 /post/ the number of the post. Okay, and that's again something that is a state of your application. Actually, exactly what happens here. We have the edit object. In this case, we have the object and not the ID of the object we would like to add or edit and so on. But I mean, the principle is the same. It's a state of the application. And the nice thing of having it on the URL is that the URL can be shared, saved, bookmarked, and so on. Okay, and it should be sufficient for rebuilding the whole exact page. Okay, as it as it was for traditional web applications. Okay, of course we need to code a little bit to achieve this behavior, and as I told you, I mean, it's not required. I mean, we will not focus on this behavior, I mean, replicating exactly the same content depending on the URL that you put in the URL box of the browser, so the address box. But in principle, it works. I mean, they make it work. They make the URL work in this way so that you can bookmark the URL, and anybody that has that URL has the same view as you. Of course, if it has permissions and so on, okay? Permissions are other stuff. And if you have the URLs, the back and forward buttons allows you to go back and forth in the pages as it happened in traditional web applications. We will not try to make the back and forward button work because, again, it's basically the same problem of making direct entering the URL work in your applications. So for the exam, we will just navigate to / and just use the interface. That's enough for the exam. It's already complicated enough to make it work in this way. Okay, I mean, not that much additional work, but I mean, it's not really important to focus on this aspect. The important aspect is understanding that we can divide the application into different views that correspond to different URLs. Because it simplifies the way in which we render the application. We don't have to add this additional states like show form, edit object, and so on. If you have 5 pages, show page 1, show page 2, show page 3, and so on. Okay? If you have URLs, you can handle this situation in a much better way. Okay, good. So, to make everything work in this configuration, in the spatial configuration for the single page applications, it is necessary that with any URL that you enter in the browser, the React application will always return the same page, so the initial page that loads the JavaScript code, and then the code will check the content of the URL and decide what to show. Okay? So the URL content is queried by the app code to customize the render and so on. Okay, but I mean, we say that this is in principle. In practice, for us, it's enough that we start from / and we navigate inside the application without handling this situation. And so let's see how the React router works. Well, we need to handle these URLs, and we will use a library. Okay, and the library has to do 2 things. Modify the URL accordingly. So we want to move to another URL. We need to tell the library to move to this other URL. We cannot just use the JavaScript API like I think document.location = 2, because the browser will reload the application. Okay, we need to tell the library that we would like to navigate to a different URL, and then the library, since it's helping us, also need to be instructed about what to show at each URL. So we need to define some routes. It means something to show for each URL that is a valid URL for our application. Okay? And to achieve this behavior, we also need to prevent the browser from fetching the next page. So indeed, actually, we cannot click on links, anchor elements in HTML, or submitting a form, and we need to instruct the React application to show only the components that belong to that URL. Okay, but this is done basically by the library, the React library that we're going to use. And actually, this is the recommended one. I would say the one we require. Okay, it's React Router. Version 7 now, very simple to install as usual. Same, the user system for installing Node packages. I mean NPM packages. And so let's see how it works. So basically, it's really easy to integrate and understand. It uses normal React components. So again, we don't have to learn anything new. I mean, there are new components, like when you bring in the React Bootstrap, you bring in buttons and lists and stuff. Here, you bring in elements that help you to navigate. Okay, link, navigate, and we will see them in a minute. And then you also bring in components that are not rendered inside the page, but are used to define the routes, so the URLs that the library should handle. Okay, and it also defines 3 hooks: use route, use navigate, use search params. Okay, we will see them in a few minutes. What they are meant to be used for. To make the library work, the whole application needs to be wrapped inside a browser router container. And this browser router, again, is a component defined by this library. So in short, we have an application now. We need to think first step before seeing this slide. Think about the routes. There's the slash, of course. There is always a slash route, okay, the default one. And then slash something, like slash about, slash dash, dashboard, and so on. What you write here is just shown in the browser URL bar, okay, the box where the URL is written. And just for you, I mean, typically the user don't care about the URL, right? You don't read the URL when you are navigating inside an application. But it's useful for you as a designer of the application to understand what, you know, what has to be shown and what's the status of the application in terms of what needs to be shown. And of course, if we define some URLs, we need to have a way to navigate to these URLs, and that's this link component that can be used inside the JSX when you need to put the link to be clicked. And at a certain point, typically in app, you need to define routes. So tell the library that when you encounter the route slash, you need to render the component home, slash about, component about, and so on. Okay? Actually, yeah, here they short the dashboard, so this one will not work. But I mean, and I need to fix this slide. In any case, these are URLs that you define yourself as a designer of the application. It's up to you to decide these URLs. Depends on what you need in terms of your application, what you need to show, how you would like to divide your application into different views. So, well, this library is quite complex. Has 3 working modes, so I can work in 3 different ways. Declarative, data, or framework. We will use the simplest one, declarative. Okay, I know it might be a bit, how to say, disappointing maybe. I don't know, but I mean, try to stick to this approach because it's easier to program. At least, well, it enables the basic routing features, so it works in a way which is simple to program, and also allows to more clearly understand and control what's happening in the application. The other modes basically make loading information from the server more automatic, but they hide a lot of things that happen in the application, which is not good for us, we are just learning React, and so, you know, it's probably too much for us. So we decided not to explore these approaches. Okay, we need to first become familiar with the React components and how to manually load information from the server inside React components and so on. And so to achieve this goal, we need to stick to this declarative approach, which is also the simplest one. So that's good news. So there are just two types of router you can use, and the one with the arrow is the recommended one. So just use browser router in your application. The hash router is just there for compatibility reasons for all the browsers and so on. It's not our case. Just forget about it. Okay. How to use it? Well, it's very simple. Import it and require some server configuration, but actually good news, not needed in our React development server. So you create the project with Byte, as we did a few lectures ago. Everything is already configured, ready to work. And just in case you would like to take this application and make it on a separate, put it onto a separate server and make it work in production and so on, you need to configure the web server a little bit. Okay, just to do what we said before, serve the same page regardless of the URL, because the URL is handled by the client. Okay, but not needed for us. And also in this course, for the exam, we will use React in development mode. So exactly the React development server installed by Byte is fine, okay? Because we would like to be able to debug something in case it's needed. We need to understand what you did inside your application, okay? There is always time, to give a command and make it a production build and put it into a server and so on. But it's more or less an automatic process. Once the things work in development mode, they get optimized to be put into production. But it's not our case. We're not interested in this last automatic step. Okay, we stay behind because we need to understand what's happening during development. And how to apply the router in our application? Well, you go here in main.jsx. You remember we said in the beginning, well, don't touch main.jsx. Well, actually, that's true, almost true, because for the browser, that's the best place where we could import browser router and wrap up inside the browser router. Okay. In previous years, I said, well, you can put it inside the app. It's true, but sometimes you need to use some functionality of the router, and so you have to define a second component, which is a direct child of app and so on. So you just use this system. Just modify the main.jsx. It's the only time we will modify the main.jsx, the one created by Byte, so the script that creates the basic skeleton of the project. We modify it to have the browser router wrap up, and that's all. Okay, and the rest can be done as usual in the files for our project inside src, app, and the rest. Okay, so once we said, well, this application uses the browser router because it's wrapped inside the browser router, well, we need to specify the routes, and the routes can be specified with the components, which are the routes and route. Note the S. Routes is just the container, and route is the single route, which has different attributes. You remember that React components have attributes, right? As before, the value equal to. Here we have path equal to, and that's the URL fragment. Okay, so the part of the URL we would like to match, and the element is the JSX element we would like to render corresponding to that URL. Okay, so you see the example here. You have a router. Okay, the router, actually that's a browser router that we put outside, okay, in main.jsx. That's why it's in blue. And then we render routes. Inside we have route path / element home, also path news element news feed, and so on. Okay, so basically here there are two URLs, the / and the /news, which we render two different components. Okay, good. That's just our choice. It's just an example. We can have, and we will have /ads, /edit, and so on. So now I spend just a few words about how to write the path and the elements. Okay, so just to have a complete view on how we can write the URLs, and then we will try. Well, probably have a break and then try. So the path is the string matched against the URL, okay? And these are examples. So of course you have slash, but you can have slash contacts, slash alt, slash news, slash doc, slash asterisk, the star, or slash something which is like the parametric URL that we saw on the server. You remember the same syntax, the colon something. This has nothing to do with the server. This is client. They just adopted the same syntax because they are used to copy one from each other. And so what's the difference? Well, the most specific path is meshed. Okay, so the router knows which routes are available, and if you write slash contact us, the route will not match slash. Of course, slash will match, but slash matches with everything, right? But it's not the most specific one. There is one which is longer and more specific that matches the URL. So basically, if you have contact us, it means that it matches contact us. This is simple, right? If you have slash use a slash something else, like a number or a string and so on, so something after the second slash, it will match this path. So it will show the element corresponding to the path that we declared with the route that we saw before, like here. Slash news, it will show the news feed. Slash, it will show the home. Okay? Good. So you can write this path in different ways. Okay, it can be case sensitive, default not recommended. I mean, try not to use URLs which are case sensitive because then it's easy to get confused. Okay, but the default is case insensitive, so no problem. It is possible to nest routes and etc. Yeah, we have an example like this, so let's talk about this. So you can nest routes. What happens if you nest routes? That basically you have a portion of the URL that is matched by the outside route, and then another part which is matched by the inside route. It's like you have a slash, let's see the example. Yeah, slash basic, slash about, slash dashboard, slash something else, okay? But it can be, I don't know, slash details user, slash details object, slash details whatever else, okay? It's a subsection of your application that is specific for some operations, okay? Or slash edit slash something, okay? So you might want to construct the URLs in a hierarchical way, and the library allows you to do that, okay? You just nest a route inside another route. And the path, so the part of the URLs are simply concatenated one after the other. And so which route is rendered? Well, the one which has the best match as before. You just need to remember that the routes are concatenated, okay? And a second thing, the matching children will be rendered inside the outlet component in the parents render tree, okay? So basically you have two parts now. The wrapping part, that's the outside route, and the nested one, that is the inside one. So which one do you render? Well, actually you render both. You render the outside and you render the inside. The point is that the inside is rendered inside a specific component you put in the outside part. We will see an example, okay? Just remember that if you forget outlet, the inside part will not be rendered. But I mean, when you are experimenting in the lab, it's easy to see the problem because something is not rendered. Very simple, okay? So let's see the example. You have app. At this point, app just return routes, okay? Route slash path element, that's a layout. That's a typical usage for this nested routes. Typically, the outside route, it's a layout route. So it gives you the layout of the page, like the left menu, the top bar, and so on, okay? And inside that layout, you want to render something different in the main part depending on the rest of the URL. Okay, so here the basic URL is slash, and the rest of the URL is what you would like to render inside, about or dashboard or whatever. Okay, so you have two elements to render. If you have slash about, you have two elements to render, both layout and about. Okay, because they match, they both match. Okay, and so, well, it's clear where you need to render the layout. It's the outside one, so it's the first one that is rendered. Where do I put the inside one? Well, the inside one is put inside the outlet. Okay, this spatial component that comes with the Reactor router, and we can use inside our components that are meant to be the wrapper outside, which are outside the other ones. Okay, so about, in case slash about, this about component will be rendered in this place where you put outlet here. Okay, so the layout is rendered, div, nav, etc., the navigation menu, whatever you have, like the left menu in the lab and so on. And then you have here outlet that is substituted by the router with what is put here inside the nested routes. Okay, so about, div, h2, about, etc. Okay, I mean, it's more difficult to say than to use it. It's mostly intuitive. I mean, it's just a hierarchy where you have two levels. The wrapper, you put outlet, and inside the outlet, the rest is rendered. Okay. Okay, there are special routes. The index route, you see there's no path, there's just an attribute, a binary attribute index, element, what is rendered. A child route with no path renders in parent's outlet as the parent URL. Typically, it's just used as the default route, okay, inside the nested routes. Okay. So they render when the user did not click one of the items in the navigation list, yes, and so on. Okay, so basically it's the default route. Okay, a layout route. Okay, no match. You can even have a no match route that basically means you can specify a path like a star, asterisk, means match everything. But that's the least priority. So basically, if nothing else matches, this matches, and so you can show a page saying, well, this URL doesn't exist. Please go back to the main page, whatever, and put a link there. Okay? As you typically do in traditional web application, this is done by the web server. Here we are on the client. It needs to be done by the client code. Okay? Okay. So a more complete example can be like this. So there's an index route, element home, okay, so slash and nothing, okay, so this index is nothing. And so you will render the layout with the home inside here instead of the outlet, okay, so it's substituted by the library. And if you have slash ABC, it doesn't exist. So you will render the no match component. Okay, that is a component you need to write. And typically you write it once, like I think we do it in the example. I mean, just this URL doesn't exist. Just go back home, link slash. Okay. Okay. Good. We have a way to define the URLs, and now we need to navigate between the URLs. Without the possibility to navigate, they are useless, right? They're just nice to see, but I mean, we would like to use them. And it's in traditional web application, you would use the anchor tag, right? A and href and the URL. But we cannot do this in single page application because this will reload the application. So we have a special component link to equals to the new URL, and this is clickable. So it's basically the same as the anchor tag in HTML, and it actually creates a link by default, and then you can you can change it You can change the appearance. You can wrap buttons and stuff like that. We will see how to do that. But it basically allows you to navigate on the client side inside your application through the router library. Okay? Or you can get a function you can call to navigate to a new URL. Because sometimes it's not convenient to have components. If you are in an event handler, you cannot just return JSX. It's an event handler, it's JavaScript code. You need to call a function. Okay? And this use navigate, it's a function provided by the router library that returns a function you can call to navigate to a new URL. Okay, never use a plain hyperlink, so the anchor tag, and never use the form submission, even though there's some special system you could use, but I mean, let's forget about it. Okay, so just prevent the application from reloading. And the two ways in which the application can reload is just clicking on a traditional link or submitting a form. Okay, and of course we don't like this behavior at the example. Why? Because it's a single page application. Everything has to be handled on the client side. Okay. Okay, so let's see some examples. So I need to navigate to a new URL. Well, just create a link. Just instead of using the anchor tag, use the link tag. Okay? It's provided by the React router library. You specify the URLs to /home, to about, that's about, and so on. Just be careful that the path that don't start with slash are relative. Okay, depending on the URL in which you are. So it's up to you to decide if you would like to always use absolute path, relative paths, and so on. Just be careful. I mean, test them. Test all of them. Okay. Just be careful if you move components. I mean, in terms of routes, of course, you need to recheck all the URLs. Or you can use absolute URLs. It's still fine, I think. This is client side, so I mean, I don't see a big problem in using absolute URLs because it's client side. Okay, and in case you are in an event handler, as I was saying before, you need to call a function to navigate to a new place, a new URL, and actually, the function that navigate to a new place is navigate. I mean, actually, it's the return value of use navigate, and you can use it in JavaScript code. Just call it with a parameter, which is a string, with the new URL. Okay. Of course, here you cannot return JSX. It's an event handler. You are already writing JSX, right? So that's the two cases you might need in your application. Creating links, clickable links in the page, or move to new URLs because of some events that happened in your application. So you handle the events in the event handlers. Okay. Good. Okay, just a few more things, then we will have the break. Okay, I'll just finish the discussion, and after the break, with fresh mind, we'll try to apply it to our example. So there are convenient components in the React router library. Like instead of link, there's a nav link. The difference is that it recognizes which URL is currently selected, and it applies an active class to its style. I mean, no, to the attribute, to the class attribute that basically is handled by some CSS, and it displays in a different way. Okay, it's typical for menus or navigation bars and so on. It's more convenient. It does things automatically for you. You don't have to highlight it manually with your code. Okay, just convenience. Dynamic routes, we saw them before. How do we define it? Well, we say the colon with some string. What is this string used for? Like ID. This ID as part of a variable part of the URL, and actually it's available to your application with the use params hook, okay, or function, call it as you like. I mean, everything starts with use is a hook in React, but actually the true hooks that we are going to see are basically use state, use context, and use effect. The rest are just functions provided by libraries that for uniformity have been called use something, okay? So use params has a look at the URL, and if there is a parametric part, it just returns these elements of the parametric part of the URL as keys inside an object, a JavaScript object, whose value is the actual value of the URL. So like this post 1234, we will get an object with the key ID and the value 1234. Okay, so basically it reads the URL and it parses the URL for us, and it separates the content it finds in the parametric parts and gives it easily available to our code in the form of a JavaScript object. Okay, as actually it happened on the server side when we were programming on the server side with Express. Okay, that's the same principle, but here everything is working on the client. It's a different library. Okay, it's the React router that does this operation for us. Okay. So like, yes, route path invoices, invoice ID, matches any URL with /invoices /something, not just numbers, also strings and so on, but typically you have numbers because you typically care about IDs in this these parametric parts of URLs, okay? And you can get the information as simple as this, okay? Or like here, params.invoice ID, which is actually the same string that you wrote here in the definition of the route, or you can extract directly from the object just the invoice ID, just different ways of writing JavaScript. Okay, same syntax. I mean, different syntax, same behavior. Okay. You can even pass a state when you navigate to a new URL. I don't recommend to use this behavior unless there's really a strong reason to do so, because it makes the application more difficult to understand. But sometimes you need to pass information to the new URL of the application, which you don't want to put or you cannot put inside the URL, like an object. You have an object with many properties and so on. You don't want to put all the objects on the URL for your convenience, typically. And so there is a second parameter to navigate. You can pass, which is an object that has a property state to which you can pass anything you like, typically another JavaScript object with many things inside. And you can get this information on the receiving side. So basically, in the function of the component that is rendered by the new URL with use location, again, another function provided by the React router library. And this use location returns an object, and there's a property inside this object, .state, that gives you access to what you passed through navigate. Okay? Since this this change of URL involves the browser, even though there's a library that handles it for us, but this state is actually a property of the location of the browser. So it comes from the browser object model. You need to be careful. In the past, we had students that tried to pass complex objects like DJS objects and so on through this system. And actually, you cannot really do that, okay? So in case you would like to use this system, just be careful. You basically can put only numbers and strings, of course, booleans and simple stuff inside this object. Other JavaScript objects, but not complex objects, not things like DJS objects and so on. Basically because they cannot be serialized and deserialized from strings very easily by the browser, okay? Okay, so just a caveat, but in general, I mean, that's an alternative to having dynamic URLs. Okay, if I cannot pass like edit slash 1234, and I would like to pass edit slash the content of the object, I mean, I cannot really use the URL, so I can just use the URL edit, and then I need a way to pass the object, and the only way we have at the moment with this library is this one. Okay, but typically an ID is enough. Okay, and so a dynamic URL is perfectly fine. You can even pass search parameters. You know that URLs support search parameters like the question mark, key equal to value, and so on. We experimented them on the server side. They can be used on the client side as well. Just remember, this is something that doesn't go to the server, because in single page applications, we will send request to the server only when we decide to send the request. So with the fetch, typically. Okay, next lecture we will see fetch and how to send request to the server and get a response back. But we send request only to get data. Okay, and so why we would like to have complex URL like this? I mean, just because we think it's a nice tool to represent the application state. Like we have a list, we are going to filter this list on the client side, and this is a way in which the current state of the application could be represented. Okay, that's fine. I mean, it's a perfectly valid URL, and all this discussion is just to tell you that there is an additional function coming from the React Router library that is use search params, that allows you to pass the part of the URL after the question mark. So this variable part that has key equal to value pairs, and it basically gives you access directly to the values given the keys. Okay, just keep it in mind in case you have these URLs that you need to handle on the client side. Okay, so this is the summary, and then we will have a break also for me. So let's start with saying, okay, we want to use the React Router library. We need to wrap everything with browser router. We do it in main.js, JSX, and then we need to define the routes. Think, slash, and slash something else, depending on your application. That's what we are going to do in the second half of the lecture. If you have nested routes, you need to find a place where to put the outlet, so the nested part inside the route, where to render it. And then when you need to navigate, just link or navlink if you want to highlight it. Use navigate or navigate in case you need to navigate to a different URL inside the what's the name? The function, the event handler. And in case you need to handle information coming from the URL, you can use params for getting the variable, I mean, the dynamic part of the URL, or search params, the stuff after the question mark, or use location for the navigation state. Okay? You typically don't use the use location to know on which URL you are, because everything should be already done by the router library, by the route definition. You can use it. If you use it, you will know which route it is. You can console log it, but I mean, typically you don't do anything with that route, okay? Because if you want to do something with that route, probably you should have defined an additional route in the list of the routes, okay? I mean, you don't want to work yourself instead of the library, okay? Okay, so I think that's all, and that's enough for now. We have a 10 minutes break, and then after the break, we will start coding and modifying the example. We have 1 hour and something to transform our application. We will not add new functionalities. We will just transform the application from what it is now, add and edit, to an application that still has add and edit, but on new pages, so on different URLs. So we will use the router that we just saw. Okay, any questions? No questions? We are tired enough? Okay. Okay, so see you after the break, 10 minutes. Okay.